Good evening, everyone. I am, most of you know, Marie Pascucci, the director of Spirit Alive. I'm delighted to welcome you to our programs and a special welcome to participants who are joining us for the first time or joining us from Canada, Australia, India, and a couple of other places for around the globe. We really welcome you to be present with us. Before I introduce our presenter, I have two announcements. One's about links. Okay. Uh, this link will get you logged in every week, but Matthew, our tech, will send you a link anyway, just in case you lose it. So don't worry about it. And I just spoke with him. I think we'll try to send the links again the night before. Sometimes if you get them just an hour before the program, you forget that you're actually in the program and you can miss it. So I think we'll do that. And the second thing I want to say is, recording. Some of you have already written to me and said, I'm going to miss a night, or, I signed up, but I have to do parish work. That's fine. All of these presentations are recorded. You have to give Matthew about 72 hours to edit the recordings and then post them online. So once they're there, you go to the Spirit Alive homepage and you'll see recordings, and that will take you to our Spirit Alive YouTube channel, and you can see this program and all of our other programs. Now, for the next 5 weeks, we're fortunate to have with us Professor Carol Dempsey, OP, who will be helping us to read the prophet's quote, "Against the grain for justice in the 21st century globalized world." Professor Dempsey is an internationally recognized and award-winning scholar who teaches biblical studies, specializing in the Old Testament Hebrew Bible. Her research interests lie in a feminist and liberation approach to biblical text, gender studies, biblical theology, literary and rhetorical criticism, and environmental and ecological studies. She's a seasoned teacher interested in educating the whole person and stimulating her students' intellectual curiosity, and I am certain she's going to stimulate yours. After completing her PhD in biblical studies at Catholic University of America in 1994, Carol joined the Faculty of Theology at the University of Portland, where she has remained and is today a full professor. Carol is the author of 8 books and the co-editor of 12 books. She has served as the vice president of the National College Theology Society and currently serves on the editorial board of the Catholic Biblical Quarterly and Old Testament Abstracts. And just this summer, Carol was elected the president of the Catholic Biblical Association of America, a wonderful thing for a scholar and a woman. Carol is a Dominican sister who hails from New Jersey, as you will hear from her unmistakable Jersey accent. Tonight, we welcome her back virtually to the East Coast and look forward to her insights, challenges, and her humor. I want you to feel free to type your questions in the chat box throughout. At about 8 o'clock, Carol will stop for a 15-minute Q&A, and she just told me that it will be a kind of interactive presentation, so she'll be asking questions and you'll be able to respond in the chat box, okay? So Carol, who is also a good friend of mine for many years, take it away. Thank you and welcome.
Thank you, Maria. That was a very generous introduction that you gave to me. And it's so good to be with everyone here tonight and to be able to share this presentation with you. So thank you so much. And I'm just delighted with the ability to have these next 5 weeks with you. Now, before I begin, let me just say that, and let me just turn something off here so that I don't keep hearing these clicks. I just want to get out of my mail. If you just bear with me for 1 minute, then you have my full attention. Good. Okay. One of the things that I we'll do tonight is introduce you to how to read biblical texts before we get into the prophets, and the prophets and justice, because those texts are very dense, and they also ask of us different questions that perhaps we're not used to asking. And so today or this evening, I'm going to introduce you to the art of reading and interpreting biblical text from the world in front of the text. And I have an outline and I'll pull it up. I also am going to share with you all of the notes that I put together. And so I will be reading from that, but I'm going to allow you to read with me because, as I say, we're going to have to think about this. And then if you have questions in between each section, I can certainly entertain the questions. Then at the very end, we're going to do an exercise. Now, for week 2, I will introduce you to prophetic literature and to the whole charism of the prophetic tradition. Week 3, we'll take a look at some of the Isaiah texts and also one common theme that runs through a lot of prophetic literature, which is Daughter Zion. Week 4, we'll look at texts that deal with the nations, the God of the empire. We'll look at Hosea 1-3, marriage texts, and we'll also deconstruct them. And week 5, we'll do a little bit from Micah 1-3 on justice, Micah 6, a little bit of Amos, and then Isaiah 53, the servant song. So that's where we're going. And if we have enough time, we'll take a look at some of the contemporary issues in our world today, also that demand a prophetic response, because the text of prophetic literature is not just the biblical text, it is the text of the world. It is the text in which we are living. And I already have, oh, yes, I got a comment. Okay, so I just saw that in the chat box. So that's a little bit about where we're going. So now let me begin with sharing my screen with you. And let's see, here we go, share. Okay. And documents. Okay. Let's see where I have my documents here. Okay. I don't know if now how to share this on here, because on my Zoom, I have all my shared material here. Give me 1 minute to look at my sharing. Matthew, are you on this with me?
I
He
am,
is.
yes.
No.
So
Yeah, I'm
if
trying to share my document here.
so if you click the green share
Yeah, I did.
rectangle, and
Yes.
then on the options, do you see a window that has your documents?
It has docs on it.
Okay, so click on that docs, and then on
Okay.
the bottom there'll be a blue rectangle that says share.
No, I don't have that blue
Oh,
rectangle.
okay, I see it's what you mean. On the top, instead of clicking documents, click screens. Do you see a tab that says screens?
No.
Um,
This is
okay.
strange because on my Zoom, I just automatically share the documents, so I don't know
Right.
what's going on here.
So what are the options on your screen right now that you see?
All right. I see whiteboard, docs, Microsoft, OneDrive, SharePoint, Dropbox.
Got it. So just above where it says whiteboard, if you go above that, there's a gray
Says
selection that
screens.
says yes, click on that.
Okay, I did. And it gives me the desktop.
Yes. And then below that, does it say application windows?
No.
It just shows a desktop. All right,
Yeah.
well, you can share the desktop and
There
then
you go.
now open up your document that you want us to see.
Okay. I just lost the document. All right. Here it is. Okay.
Great.
Yes.
Okay, we got it. Good.
Mhm.
All right. Thank you. Little different than what I had. Now, okay. So this is where we're going, the outline for week 1. The review of the course description, just so I have everybody on the page, the pedagogical approach I'll be using, and then creating a foundation. And when I teach my classes and when I teach my prophets course as well, I put everybody on the same page. And so these are the key points that we're going to talk about tonight. The art of reading against the grain, which is part of the foundation, culture, identity, social location, and reading biblical texts. And then under that, we're going to take a look at culture and identity in the Bible, culture and identity of readers, culture and our reading of the Bible, social location and biblical interpretation, and the hermeneutical circle. Then we're going to, I'm going to offer you 3 hermeneutical principles, and we can discuss those. Then moving into new biblical horizons of interpretation, and then biblical interpretation, culture, and power, decolonizing the God of the Bible, the God of the prophets, and then a preliminary exercise, which I'm going to take from Genesis because we're very familiar with the Genesis story of Hagar, Ishmael, and Sarah. And then I'll have some concluding comments because this will warm us up to how we are going to approach and read prophetic texts and understand them in new and different ways, other than reading with what I call the hegemonic narrative and reading with the grain. And we're going to read them in the context of the globalized world today. So to begin, and let me see, I think maybe what I can do is just, I want to get this so that everybody can see this. And I don't want to lose you, so let me just do my view here. Let me get rid of this. Okay. All right, view. Okay. Just bear with me 1 minute here because I'm trying to navigate this down to the bottom of the screen. Okay. Okay, this is the page with okay. I just want to get this to 250. Okay. Okay, can everybody see that comfortably?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So where we're going now with this. All right, so the review of the course description. This is what I want to go over. I just want to review this with you. For centuries, readers and interpreters of the Bible have traditionally read the text with the grain. Many have sought to use the Bible for personal and spiritual enrichment and nourishment. Today, however, we live in the 21st century globalized world, and if we want to achieve global justice, of which the prophets are about, then we have to begin to read the biblical text against the grain and interpret it critically. New interpretation theories help us to see how cultures and cultural attitudes have shaped the Bible and how the Bible, as the most read book in the world, continues to shape and re-inscribe various cultural attitudes that are oppressive and that have an effect on our political, social, economic, and religious institutions. In other words, how one's reading of the Bible and its use contribute to present-day patriarchy, kyriarchy, abuse, hierarchy, racism, gender discrimination, heteronormativism, ethnocentrism, classism, ableism, anti-Semitism, imperialism, and marginalization in our world today. In this presentation, we will explore new ways of reading the biblical literature from the prophets against the grain to discover new understandings of ancient poems and the work to be done for global justice. Included in our discussion is the topic of gender in God as we explore hegemonic power, because there's no way we can talk about the prophetic texts without dealing with the portrait of God in the prophets, because you have a militaristic deity here, and you have a hegemonic deity, and you have also a view that presents the deity as being very violent and very abusive. And we're used to just reading and praying with these prophetic texts and saying, oh, yes, yes, it's the God of justice who's going to destroy the enemies and save the good people. Well, who are the enemies and who are the good people? These are the questions that we have when we read against the grain. So now, what's my pedagogical approach for this course? I will be using a radical democratic emancipatory approach created by the Catholic New Testament Bible scholar Elizabeth Schussler Fiorenza in conversation with Paulo Freire's approach, the pedagogy of the oppressed. Because as we know, the prophets are about talking to the people on the margins and also taking sides with the people on the margins. However, the question we have to ask, to what extent are the prophets themselves colonized? To what extent are they under the spell of this hegemonic deity? And what is their prophetic message? Is their prophetic message truly a transformative message, or is it one of fire and brimstone that they have to deliver, as we see it in the prophetic texts, from a God of fire and brimstone? Yeah, so we have all of these different issues that we have to deal with in the prophets, and we can't even begin to deal with these issues and these texts until we take a look at the approach that we're going to use, and then social location. So this pedagogical approach is going to emphasize the systemic analysis of structures and mindsets of domination. It stresses the agency and struggle of the marginalized and erased voices. It goes against the grain. Its focus is on the world in front of the text, reads from and with the margins. The style is not combative or competitive, but deliberative, engaging in conversations about values and beliefs that are most important. Does not retreat into positivism, dogmatism, or relativism, which avoids engagement with the differences. And see, that's a big thing, because oftentimes we see that the Bible has been weaponized. We hold it as an authoritative text, but we've used it oftentimes in an authoritative way, to tell people what is just and what is right. The question remains, from whose perspective? So it's also going to, this pedagogy equips readers for critically questioning and debating in order to be able to arrive at deliberative judgments about the Bible's contributions to the good life. Okay. And so we're going to look at it in different ways. So here's the foundation. So what do I mean when I say we're going to read against the grain? Well, this kind of reading reads from the perspective of justice, from socio, gender, ecological justice. Because when we see in the prophetic text, and we will see this in Isaiah, we'll see this in Isaiah, in Amos, and I'll do as much as I can with these texts and deconstruct them and interpret them for you, with you, I should say, not for you. We're going to see that in order to punish the people for not being obedient to God, God is going to send a blight on the fields and pestilence. And so, from an ecological perspective, how do we hear these texts? What kind of a God do we have that will send all of the terror upon the natural world just so that the people don't have anything to eat, so they go to bed hungry? These are the issues that we're going to have to deal with. Okay, and it's how do we understand obedience? Obedience to what kind of a deity do we have here? Okay, so it's going to read from the marginalized perspective of the marginalized. It's going to deal with race, gender, ethnicity, disableism, class, gender, orientation. It deconstructs texts to read texts in new ways and to hear texts in relation to our world and its pressing issues. It analyzes the dominant reading of a text and engages in alternative and resistant readings of a text. And how can this text be read differently? That's always the question that we have before us. Resistant readings scrutinize the beliefs and attitudes that typically go unexamined when reading and interpreting texts. And it pushes back against the privileging of a dominant point of view, often empire-centered, androcentric, white, Eurocentric, and Western. And I must say that this kind of dominant point of view is oftentimes how we read with the grain and how our preachers preach on these biblical texts. And so it combines synthesis and analysis and evaluation and creation. Okay. Now, the next point is culture, identity, social location, and reading biblical texts. This is important. Culture is the sum total of everyday practices and texts. The way we live our everyday lives, behavior, beliefs, social interactions, values, points of view, traditions, all human production, clothes, food, art, ideology, music, institutions, language, reflects culture. Okay. And we who are on the Zoom tonight are multicultural, and we come from many countries. We come from the global north and we come from the global south. And how the global north hears prophetic literature, hears biblical text, is going to be sometimes quite different from how it's heard in the global south. How those of us who are very traditional Catholics, it's going to be very different in the hearing of the texts, how progressive Catholics might hear it. Those of us who are from straight communities may hear these texts different from communities that are LGBTQ plus. And so it's social location, it's how we hear these texts. It's also how culture has shaped us as well. As I say to my students, I don't care what you believe. I don't care what you think. Just know why you think what you think, and just know why you believe what you believe. Culture is the collective space where meanings we produce are assimilated or resisted. Culture shapes the way we see life, understand the world, define ourselves, think, act, create community, relate to others, express our sense of belonging to family, groups, nations, and tribes. Identity can be defined in different ways. Identity is shaped by power relations, Western and non-Western and other ethnic identities. Okay, so we're going to have to look at the power bases in these texts. Identity is not unified. Identity is fractured, ruptured, discontinuous, contradictory, always changing and in flux and in process. We can have multiple identities. Now, culture and identity in the Bible. Writers assumed that their place in and their perspective of the world was normative for all humankind. And sometimes that's also what we assume too. We don't know who any of these writers are. But when we start to voice our opinions, do we assume that our opinion is normative? Do we assume that we have a piece of the truth? Or is what is normative just for us and not necessarily for other cultures? And one of the things that I find so refreshing in my classes when I teach is I have students who are multicultural. So I have Asian students, African students, Indian students, indigenous students, white students, all different kinds of people who hear these texts in different ways. Their perspectives come from, the writer's perspectives of the text comes from a small colonized group of people who lived in successive generations in the land called Canaan. That's important to know. Whoever wrote and edited these texts and the prophetic texts came from a small group of people. They were trying to establish a national identity and ethnicity, and they saw others as other. Okay, they saw others as other. And it's absolutely dynamic to teach prophetic literature right now with everything that is going on in the Middle East. Because do the Israelis see the Palestinians as other? Do the Palestinians see the Israelis as others? And yet they're all Jewish people. How do we see other people? Do the Russians see the Ukrainians as others? Do the others see the Russians as others? Now, see, and what we have going on here in the Middle East and also with Russia and Ukraine is the struggle for empire. That's the same struggle that was going on in biblical literature. It was the Assyrians, the Egyptians, the Babylonians, the Romans, the Greeks, all of them struggling for power, for possession, for land, for peoples, for domination. So what we see in prophetic literature and what we will see is no different than what we have going on in today's world. And that's the problem. The problem is not with the biblical text. The problem is the cultures in which we are embedded. And when we talk about transformation, what does this book, this prophetic literature tell us what is in need of transformation? And it basically is the way we conduct our business, because history has not changed. Despite all our advancement, our history of domination and violence has not changed. So the culture that we find in the biblical text, which is what we find today in our world, is largely androcentric, anthropocentric, patriarchal, hierarchical, heteronormative, gendered, and ethnocentric. Okay, so that's where we are. So past and present. So culture and identity of readers. Approaches to reading and interpreting biblical texts, as well as biblical commentaries, as well as the commentaries that we consult, have been heavily influenced by Germany, especially the use of the historical critical approach to reading and interpreting texts. And by that I mean the historical critical approach says what the text meant in its day is what the text means today. And it's always the search for authorship. What's the intent of the author? What's the intent of the community? What's the intent of the text? What's the meaning of the text? And we're going to talk about that, because there is no one meaning to a text. And we don't know who these writers or editors are. So how can we ever think that we're going to discover the intent? And yet the commentaries that we see, even from the feminist commentaries and from the non-feminist commentaries, are written from various perspectives from people that have cultural biases themselves. And that's why we have to do meta-commentating on it. We have to question everything. We can't take anything as absolute, because we have to listen, 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 and continually appropriate. So, culture and identity of readers. Approaches to reading and interpreting texts, as well as biblical commentaries, as I say, have been influenced by Germany. Okay, so culture and our reading of the Bible. Culture shapes our faith and how we read life and the Bible. Culture shapes our faith and how we read life and the Bible. So I often say the Bible is just one text among many texts. And basically what we have to learn how to do and continue to do is read the text of life. because the text of life is what shaped this biblical story and these biblical passages that we have in the prophets, the text of life. No single understanding of the Bible exists that will be valid for everyone. And that's so wonderful. One of the things that, we've moved into with this historical critical is trying to determine, oh, this is the meaning, the intention of the text. Well, Thomas Aquinas, my dear Dominican brother, said there's multiple meanings to biblical texts. And the Jewish way of interpreting text is to say there are multiple meanings of the text. And so the Jewish people would sit together in the synagogue and interpret biblical texts from different perspectives. But for some reason, we have reduced everything to saying there's one meaning of the text or there's one intention of the text. Understanding is always modified by one's context. Diverse readers from diverse social locations will hear and interpret the biblical text in diverse ways. That's an important piece here. Diverse understanding and interpretations need to be respected for their richness, which allows us to respect the otherness in ourselves and in our world. And that, if you ask me, is one area where Catholic biblical interpretation needs to grow. And our preaching needs to grow in this regard. So, social location and biblical interpretation. How we read biblical texts and interpret them is going to be different from person to person. There is no meaning to a text. Readers, grounded in their social locations, create biblical meanings to texts, and I'll come back to that. What we aim for is a responsible reading and interpretation of text. The Bible reflects culture, has the potential to influence culture, and creates culture. As interpreters of text, we need to be conscious of gender, race, ethnicity, orientation, class, status, what is normative, what is not, who and what is on the margins, who is erased. The biblical stories and poems all have a political agenda that needs to be examined closely and carefully. Imagine that. The biblical stories and the poems have a political agenda, and we can't forget that. Okay? The biblical text is revelatory insofar as it shows us what is still in need of transformation. Okay? Because too often we have boxed in this whole understanding of revelation and said, oh, this is the revealed word of God. Yeah, okay, but from what perspective are we reading these texts? So the Bible is a story and not actual history. That we also have to remember. The biblical material has been edited many, many, many times. Many translations of the Bible exist in different languages, and every translation is an interpretation. And I've worked with several committees on various translations of various Bibles, and always there is the question, how do we interpret this word? How do we understand this? And we always talk about a dynamic translation. And how are we to understand the text in the context of contemporary times? Now, many of the characters in the Bible probably did not exist. Now, that can be disconcerting for people, but that's a point that we need to think about. And the Jewish and the faith communities and traditions take the Bible as the story, but not in a literalist, fundamentalist way. That's the important thing, not in a literalist and fundamentalist way. And what has happened right now is we have the strong influence of the Christian right and the Catholic Christian right who take this text in a fundamentalist, literalist way. And the Protestant tradition has often talked about sola scriptura. And when I talked with one of my colleagues, Dr. Suzanne Schultz, who is also my Old Testament colleague, she's like, oh, yes, many of the Catholic and the Catholic translations and interpretations have moved over to what was sola scriptura. And forgets about the tradition, forgets about the history of interpretation, forgets that our theology is much broader than just biblically based, because we also have the whole mystical tradition. But for some reason, we've reduced so much to, what does the Bible say? Now, the hermeneutical circle consists of the world behind the text, the world of the text, the world in front of the text, all interacting. So there is a world behind this text. We know that there were Babylonians. We know that there were Romans. We know that there was a struggle for power. The world of the text, we see, okay, what is the language of this text? What are we reading with this text? How is culture embedded in this text and the culture of the biblical times? And the world in front of the text. How do we hear this text today? So we're going to have an eye toward the world behind the text and the world of the text, but we're going to listen to it from our social locations and our present day. So there's three hermeneutical principles. The three hermeneutical principles that we have, and it comes from Suzanne Schultz's book, The Bible as Political Artifact, which, by the way, is an extraordinary book. And I think it should be read by anybody who is interested in Bible. And I've taught the book now in my undergraduate classes to sophomores, juniors, seniors, and some first-year students for the past 5 years, and they love it. So I encourage you to maybe think about reading that text. Three hermeneutical principles. All sacred texts, including the Bible, are inherently flexible, elastic, and ambiguous. All sacred texts, which means that they can be heard in different ways. And then every translation is an interpretation. That's a given. And then readers, grounded in their social locations, create biblical meanings. Okay, so how will our brothers and sisters in the global South hear these texts? How will people of color hear these texts? How will people in political positions hear these texts? These are the questions. How will people on the margins hear these texts? Okay, now, moving into the new biblical horizons of interpretation. We can no longer read and interpret the Bible, especially the prophets, in what my Old Testament colleague Suzanne Schultz defines as a privatized, personalized, sentimentalized way, divorced from the world and its major issues and concerns. Okay? She reminds me all the time, Carol, the world is burning up, and we are still sitting with the Bible on our laps, trying to say, okay, how is this going to deepen my spiritual life? That's important, but our spirituality has to be a spirituality that is global, that is transformative, and it can't be privatized anymore, sentimentalized. I suggest that we have to move away from using the Bible as an authoritative text for social, political, economic, and religious policies and practices aimed at the colonization of people's hearts, minds, spirits, and intellects, thus keeping them entrenched in structures and systems of thought that promote and support systemic injustice. Okay? And we've used this Bible, we've weaponized this Bible to create policies, be it religious policies, economic policies, political policies, and social policies that have discriminated people, that have harmed people. Unfortunately, many people of faith have increasingly moved into a privatized, personalized, and sentimentalized reading of the Bible, searching for spiritual nourishment or a moral code for living, a kind of reading rooted in sola scriptura, a Christian theological doctrine held by most Protestant Christian denominations, the evangelical denominations, in particular the Lutheran and Reformed traditions that posits the Bible as the sole infallible source of authority for Christian faith and practice. Do you see how we, even in terms of Catholics, have really moved over into this whole sola scriptura view of things. So said differently, we are now seeing the rise of biblical fundamentalism and literalism that extends not only to how we read and interpret biblical texts, but how we read and interpret any texts. And I suggest that we make the connection here to the thought of those Christian Catholic Supreme Court justices trained in originalism. All right. And that's a key issue here, because originalism and the historical critical approach to biblical texts is the same. What is the intention of the biblical authors? We don't know. What's the intention of the framers? It's all going to be interpretation. That's the big divide that we have in the Supreme Court in how the Constitution is being interpreted. If the Bible is to continue to have any impact on our world today, then it must be read and interpreted in global context, and this is where our work as readers and interpreters begins. Reading for justice in all spheres of life, especially when we approach the prophetic texts. And reading for justice means that we have to start with the world in front of the text, reading against the grain. Okay, so I'm just going to skip down just a little bit because I covered some of this already. Thus, while the biblical text contains political, cultural, social, and religious inscriptions that, when deconstructed, can be deemed discriminatory, it is human writers and editors who did the inscribing and human interpreters who continue to inscribe discrimination into our world today through their hegemonic interpretations and their weaponization of text, many of whom come from the colonizing Western world and its religious traditions. Okay, so then we have this whole section on biblical interpretation, culture, and power. And I'm just conscious of the time because I want to get to an exercise with you. But I will go over some of these questions, and I will send you this entire lecture for you. So we have to ask the question always, what did culture play in shaping the text? How does culture continue to shape how we read, interpret, and use the text today? How do different cultures read the Bible and the prophetic text today? Okay. How is meaning constructed, and who constructs the meaning? Who's saying this is what the text means? Who has power? Who does not? Who speaks? Who's silent? Who's erased? Okay. How do we read text from and with the margins, or from a place of perspective, privilege? And here's a classic example. Do we read text from a male-centered, androcentric, patriarchal perspective that either overlooks or celebrates male performance in the text, including the performance of a male deity we call by the gendered term God? The word God is a gendered term. It comes from El, which is the Canaanite tradition, and it was a male gendered term. And the Israelite tradition then took over El and made it Elohim, hence we get the term God. Then in Exodus 15, aren't we happy when the song of Moses and Miriam celebrate how God and Moses defeat the Egyptian armies? Horse and chariot he has cast into the sea. Our God, warrior is his name. Since when is the violent loss of life on either side to be celebrated, not to mention that the Egyptians' horses are drowned too? Violence that affects the human and non-human world. Is it not time to reconsider liberation theological perspectives that are not tied to ethnocentric perspectives? See, I bet you, some of you may not even have thought about that when we read Exodus 15, but it's a powerful, powerful poem. And we're going to see this in the prophets. And do we fail to realize that all the characters, even God, the deity, are products of the male imagination? Because if we understand that the biblical text was composed by male authors and edited by male editors, because they were the ones who were educated when this text was being composed, when this text was being compiled, everything comes from the male imagination, even how women are portrayed. even how women are portrayed. So when we say we're going to have a course on women in the Bible, do we take a look at how the women are portrayed? I mean, that is a big, big, big issue that we have to consider. Okay. And then, so I want to skip down then to some of this. And Esther Fuchs, the Jewish Old Testament Bible scholar, makes clear that the Bible is not merely authored, edited, transmitted, and canonized by men, but it also endorses and promotes a patriarchal ideology. She argues further that scholars working with newer hermeneutical models and approaches to biblical interpretations do not see the Bible merely as a product of male centered culture, but as one of the texts that actively created this culture, having disrupted and replaced previous cultures in which women were regarded as deities, as potential leaders, as equals. The Bible, then, is a text of culture. And not only is it a text of culture, but it's a text in cultures itself. And so it shapes our imagination, it shapes our faith traditions. And, Elizabeth Schussler Fiorenza has a whole wonderful, marvelous book that she has written on the rhetoric of empire and the Bible. And I just want to highlight a couple of points for this. And in considering the God metaphors and imagery, specifically the great king, heavenly monarchy, Lord of lords, avenging warrior, and all-powerful God who reigns in imperial splendor, rules heaven and earth, demands obedience and homage from his subjects. Fiorenza makes this point. Whereas this imperial God language has been used in the past to legitimate monarchy and colonial expansion and to reject democracy as against God's will, today it is promulgated not so much in the political as in the religious liturgical realm, and thus functions as one of the technologies of the self that fosters kyriarchal internalizations of empire. Even though a metaphor is a rhetorical device, metaphors have the potential to produce meanings, to construct realities, to affect realities, and therefore to affect one's imagination, especially one's theological imagination, and thus influence belief systems that can either liberate or colonize or control. Okay, now that's powerful because we can dismiss all of this language that we have in the prophets as being metaphorical. Well, on one level, it is metaphorical, but on the other level, when we read this within faith traditions, it justifies and it justifies and it sanctions certain acts that are violent, discriminatory, and abusive. And we've got to look at this. Okay. So this goes on, and we can talk about this because we are going to see the imperial deity in the biblical text. Okay. And so she's got a whole lot here. And then, if the discourse about the divine is to be in the context of interreligious and interfaith dialogue, then the whole dualistic oppositional construct of monotheism and polytheism, as presented in the Bible, because that's one of the big things that the prophets present, because you do not believe in only me, you will be condemned. Because you have other faith traditions that are condemned because they don't believe in Israel's God. And that's something we've got to examine. Because how do we understand Israel's God? And if we are talking about the divine, then we are talking about spirit, and we are talking about a spirit that permeates all of creation. Excuse me. So the divine lives, rests, pulsates, and breathes within all creation, and not just within the human dimension of creation. And all creation live, rests, pulsates, and breathes within the divine. Okay, and that's an important piece. And that, by the way, is sacramentality, and that is key to the Catholic tradition that we see. But for some reason, we are losing this in terms of a focus now on the Bible, a focus on Jesus, a focus on an authoritarian understanding of the text, influenced by Christian evangelicalism. Okay, now I got 10 minutes. I want to do an exercise with you, but I also want to stop just for a minute because I've given you a lot of material here, a lot of material, but this is where we're going. And your homework is going to be to reread through some of this in preparation for our discussion of prophetic literature. But does anyone have a question right now that you would like to put into the chat, or something that I can clarify, or you can hold it until we have our 15 minutes? But I do want to do an exercise with you. Or if somebody wants to just unmute and just jump in, that's fine too. Okay, we got a chat. All right, we're okay. Got a comment? Thanks, great so far. All right. Okay, then let me keep going. Let's do an exercise. Now, with everything I've said, let's listen to this story from Genesis, okay? It is the typical story of Abraham, Sarah, and Hagar, and I chose it because we know what this story is about. We know that God portrayed throughout the biblical text pretty much as a male deity, even though, you've got some other minor imagery that's there, but portrayed primarily as a male deity, enters into covenant with Abraham and says, I will make a great nation of you, and your descendants will be as many as the stars and the sands of the sea. Okay, so we get that. We also know that then the problem is that Sarah, for some reason, according to the text, cannot bear children right away. All right. So we get what I say to my students: the opening and closing of the womb, of the woman's womb, by God. It's always the woman's problem. It's never the man's problem. Maybe Abraham had a slow seed. Who knows? But all we know is that we've got three people now. We've got Abraham, who has to produce a male heir because it's going to be the male who's going to inherit the covenant and be part of the covenant, which starts this patrilineal image of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and it's also patriarchal. And then you have these two women. Now, the significant piece here is that as Canaanite people, Abraham and Sarah are Middle Eastern people. They're brown, okay? Hagar, who comes from Egypt as the maidservant, is going to be a darker complexion and probably, most definitely, maybe black. All right, so you've got three people of color, but you got colorism here. All right, you got colorism here. And the fact that Abraham and Sarah are able to have a maidservant puts them in the position of being rather well-to-do. And Hagar, being the maidservant, is the one who has to abide by what the household is. Okay, so here's our story. Now, Sarai, and just listen to the words, and I'm going to emphasize some of them. Abram's wife bore him no children. She had an Egyptian slave girl whose name was Hagar. And Sarai said to Abraham, you see that the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. Go in to my slave girl. It may be that I shall obtain children by her. And Abraham listened to the voice of Sarai. So after Abram had lived 10 years in the land of Canaan, Sarai, Abram's wife, took Hagar, the Egyptian, her slave girl, and gave her to her husband Abraham as a wife. He went into Hagar, and she conceived. and they went into the nice way of saying they had sexual relations. And when she saw that she had conceived, she looked with contempt on her mistress. Then Sarai said to Abram, "May the wrong done to me be upon you. I gave my slave girl to your embrace, and when she saw that she had conceived, she looked at me with contempt. May the Lord judge between you and me." But Abram said to Sarai, "Your slave girl is in your power. Do to her as you please." Then Sarai dealt harshly with her, and she ran away. The angel of the Lord found her by a spring of water in the wilderness, the spring on the way to Shur. And he said, "Hagar, slave girl of Sarai, where have you come from and where are you going?" And the angel of the Lord said, and she said, "I am running away from my mistress." The angel of the Lord said to her, "Return to your mistress and submit to her." The angel of the Lord said to her also, "I will so greatly multiply your offspring that they cannot be counted for multitude." And the angel of the Lord said to her, "Now you have conceived, and you shall bear a son. You shall call him Ishmael, for the Lord has given heed to your affliction. He shall be a wild ass of a man, with his hand against everyone, and everyone's hand against him. And he shall live at odds with all his kin. So she named the Lord who spoke to her, "You are El Roi." For she said, "Have I really seen God and remained alive after seeing him?" Therefore, the well was called Beer Laharoi. It stands between Kadesh and Berid. Hagar bare Abram a son, and Abram named his son, whom Hagar bore, Ishmael. Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bore him Ishmael. Okay, now, if we had more time, we would unpack these questions, but I'll unpack them for you. What is your initial response to the story? Who is on the margins? What are the power dynamics in the story? What are the ethnic and gender dynamics in the story? Who's essentialized in the story? And what does this story tell us about the justice that needs to be served and to whom? See, these are the questions we're going to have to ask in the prophetic literature as well. Okay, so when we look at this, the initial response to the story, perhaps you say, "Oh, this is okay. She's going to bear a child and she's cast out, and God's going to take care of her and take care of the child." Or the other response should be, "We are irate about this story." And when we look at this, okay, when we look at the story, what goes on here is that you got a patriarchy, you got a hierarchy. So you've got the male deity over Abraham, the male. Abraham is over Sarai, his wife. Sarai is over Hagar, the maidservant. So you've got one woman having power over another woman. You got Abraham having power over Sarai, and you've got God having power over everybody. In terms of Sarai's sexuality, okay, which, by the way, is an important point here. You know, the males having the power, a male deity, a male having the power over the reproductive system of the woman. All right, now, so you can hear all kinds of things in this story. So, first of all, we see that Sarah is defined as Abram's wife. She has no identity of her own. She's defined as the male's wife. She bears him no children. The essentialization of women is that women are important insofar as they can bear children. And in biblical times, that was the purpose of the woman. The woman was to bear the children. And it was, what shall I say? The preference was to bear the male children because, as I say, it was a patrilineal, patriarchal society where all the inheritance came through the males. And that's the story of Ruth and Boaz and Naomi and the Levirate marriage that you have there. Okay, so the males controlled everything. All right, now, ethnocentric. You have Hagar, the Egyptian. Notice when I read this, how many times whoever wrote this or edited this text called her an Egyptian slave girl. So you've got ethnocentrism here, and you've got classism here. Egyptian slave girl. 6 different times she's called the Egyptian slave girl. So there is a cultural, ethnocentric, class, race, biasm, bias embedded in the biblical translation of this text. Okay, we have to look at it this way. All right, now then you see the power and social status. Hagar is the slave, and she has to have sex with Abraham, who's her master, and Sarah has handed her over. She has no choice. She has no voice. And so what you have here is Sarah handing over a woman. Sarah traffics a woman and hands her over to Abraham. But Abraham is under constraints because it's the deity who wants to have the male child, who wants to have the child. So you get a whole group of people here, the 3 of them, who are colonized, who are victims of their times, their culture. But at the same time, you don't hear Abraham saying to the deity, no, I'm not going to do this. I'm not going to do this. You don't hear Sarah saying, I'm not going to turn over my slave girl. You see all of these people being obedient. Abraham obedient to God. Sarah handing over Hagar. Hagar having to be obedient to Sarah and to Abraham. The woman finally runs away in desperation. But what happens? She encounters the angel of the Lord, the angel of God, who says, return to your mistress and submit to her. Wow. Wow. So we see Sarah and Hagar under extreme pressure, 2 women. Women are essentialized. We see the oppression where Hagar is sent back by the angel and told to submit. And then you see the angel telling Hagar what to name her son. The woman doesn't even have the agency to name her own son. And then the child that she's going to have is going to be a male baby. He will be the child of promise, but he's said to be a wild ass of a man. Everyone is going to turn against him. So he's not going to be accepted among the Canaanite, among the Hebrew, among the Israelite people. And eventually, Hagar is going to take him back to Egypt, to her own country. But we look at here a dynamic within a family setting, within a household. And we see the racism, the classism, the essentialization. We can't justify Abraham's actions. We can't justify Sarah's actions. But we can understand that they are victims of their culture in one sense, internalized the misogyny of their culture. And Hagar turns around, and the only thing that we see, the action on her part, is that she looks contempt on Sarah. And all the biblical interpreters of this verse says that this look of contempt is to be interpreted as she is saying to Sarah, ha ha, I'm pregnant and you're not. She looks contempt with Sarah because Sarah can't deliver a child at this point in time, and she can. But that's not the interpretation from another perspective. Another perspective hears this to say that Hagar looks upon Sarah with contempt because Sarah turned her over to Abraham. And essentially, this is not about Hagar being a surrogate, that interpreters of the Bible have interpreted this. It is about Abraham raping the slave woman who had no power. Wow. So, how do we hear biblical texts today? How do we hear texts like this, which have, if we read Paul, the writings of Paul, Paul says it's credited to Abraham as being the obedient one. It's credited to Sarah as being the one to be respected. She's the woman of freedom. Hagar is the woman of slavery. Sarah is to be the one that's emulated, not Hagar. So when we read this for justice on the margins, who's marginalized here? Hagar and Ishmael. And Hagar becomes, because Abram leaves her, she becomes, in another way, when we read this in contemporary contexts, she becomes the first single parent. The first single parent. But do we hear that today? From whose perspective do we read the story? When we listen to how the story is preached, what do we preach on when we preach the story? And how do we understand this from the perspective of women of color, of children of color, of women and children in general? And how do we hear this today when women are essentialized? And how do we hear the power dynamics in the story? How do we understand the deity in this story? Return and submit. Is this the God of liberation or is this the God of oppression? These are the kinds of questions we're going to have to ask when we're viewing the prophetic texts. And so when we ask ourselves the question, then, how are we to hear this in light of justice? What is the biblical text calling us to? What is it calling us to? How are we to act with justice? And for whom? And who deserves justice in this story? Okay, now I got something in the chat here. Okay. Yes.
Yeah. Carol,
Okay,
maybe you
good.
can,
All right, now we have questions. I want to do questions and answers here.
can you stop sharing your screen so everybody can see you? Great,
Yes, here I am.
great, thanks. So, with the time left, people are free to raise their hands if they'd like to ask, unmute. I have a question for you to get the ball rolling. It's actually not a question, but as I was listening to you talking about, uh, the men who produce these stories and who are part of this culture of patriarchy, have a hegemonic mindset and so on. I was thinking, when you look at what's happening in society today and the women who adopted a hegemonic patriarchal and hierarchical mindset and who voted for Trump uh, and who interpret the bullet passing through his ear, in terms of, the saved Messiah who's coming to save us. I mean, you, I guess, um, you, I guess what I wrote here is that, the, the idea of a male deity with power and patriarchy and hierarchy, it's doesn't seem to be the reserve of only men. Women can adopt
That's
that
right.
same posture, right?
That's exactly right. And we see this with Hagar, Sarah handing over Hagar.
Right.
And we see this as we see this time and time again. And we see this in the biblical text with even, the story of Judith, where she chops off Holofernes' head. Well, that's what the male soldiers are doing. The women did it then, the women are doing it now. But that is, women who are reading the book of Judith will say, yes, yes, this is so marvelous and wonderful, but it's violent.
Right.
But
Anybody else?
that's part of the problem that we have with reading these texts in a literalist, fundamentalist way,
Mhm,
and in an authoritative way, because it justifies all kinds of things.
mhm. I'm looking to see if any hands are up. I'm not seeing any. Um, it could be a comment. You don't have to have a
Yeah.
question. Have a comment. Please feel free.
And feel free to challenge, disagree, ask for clarification, whatever. I gave you a lot tonight. I gave you a lot,
Mhm.
but it's foundational.
Was and somebody has written in the chat box, are all victims of the system, especially Haggai, are all victims of the system, especially Haggai. It is a mentality religious and spiritual abuses are. Maureen Taft, do you want to finish your comment because I don't? It seems like it got cut off. Maureen, are you here? Would you like to unmute and make your comment?
No, it was basically that I saw all three people are victims of this abusive system. You
Okay.
know, it's a way of thought, it's a way of looking at life and looking at everything. Yes, it's Hagar that has really been the abused physically and whatever, but Sarah's just caught up in the system too.
Yep.
And to a certain extent, it's also Abraham, whatever. So, you know, it an abusive system abuses everybody.
That's exactly right. I mean, that's exactly right, Maureen. And when we look at this though, yeah, it's male performance. And part of the problem is that in masculinity studies, this kind of male performance is justified without seeing that you are a victim of this whole cultural attitude that has shaped men and shaped women.
Yeah.
It shaped everyone.
Mhm.
And it's shaping us today because
Yep.
this kind of thinking is still here. And also for me, it's shaping us because I don't hear priests getting up or even sisters or anybody else who's a teacher or catechist. I don't get up, see people getting up and saying what you have said, you know. So it carries down to us. We're the
That's
inheritors.
very true. And I mean, I just started my semester this week. And what I've shared with you is the foundation that I give to my, my I call them my baby Bible people, the interpretation of biblical texts in global contexts, and then it's in all my upper division courses. And one of my students said to me, "This is a lot to take in." I said, "Yeah, it is," but they like it because they are tired of the same old, and they want change and they want transformation as well too. But I have students who say, "Why aren't we talking about this in our churches? Why aren't our pastors talking about this? Why aren't we looking at it from this perspective?" And they come from Catholic grade schools and Catholic high schools, and they're secular and they're different religious perspectives. But we're so used to just reading and taking things in and not thinking about things critically.
Mhm. Well, Carol, It's 8:15. Everybody got an enormous amount to think about tonight. And I want to thank you. We'll all be back next week. And maybe we should give the last word to Fran Smullen, who wrote to everyone. It suits the purposes of patriarchy to set women against women, to have women seen as emotional, hysterical. It does something in the space of family violence that condones the violence.
Yeah.
Amen. Tonight, as we leave, let's continue to pray together that this peace deal really goes through for the suffering people of Gaza and for all the hostages and for all the family members who have been waiting for 15 months to find out if their children, their husbands, their spouses are all dead and alive, as they are all pawns in what Carol talked about tonight, which is the nation building and empire. So good night, everybody. This was great. See you next Thursday.
Thank you. It's been delightful to be with you, and I'll be a little bit slower next week.
All right. Thanks, Carol. Good night.
Thank
Good night,
you.
everybody.
That was
Good night.
wonderful.
That was wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.